Ladies and gentlemen, when someone truly hates you, they rarely come at you with honesty. They don't always scream. They don't always insult you to your face, and they almost never announce, "I hate you." Instead, they become strategic, they become subtle, and they deliver their hatred in ways that can ruin you without leaving fingerprints. Because real hatred is not only an emotion, it is a decision, a long-term desire to see you weakened, confused, and small. And psychology shows us something uncomfortable. The person who genuinely hates you will often give you two things, and if you don't recognize them early, you will swallow them like medicine when they are actually poison. The first thing they give you is confusion, and the second thing they give you is doubt. True hatred is rarely loud, it is strategic, subtle, and designed to protect itself from exposure. Because the moment hatred is obvious, it can be confronted, and the moment it can be confronted, it loses leverage. That is why the most dangerous form of hatred often hides behind politeness, calm tone, "I'm just being honest," or even a friendly smile. A person who truly hates you usually does not want a fair fight, they want an unfair advantage, and the easiest advantage is to harm you while still looking innocent. Psychology shows that when someone is openly hostile, you naturally create distance, you set boundaries, you protect yourself. But when someone disguises hostility as concern, humor, or neutrality, your brain stays uncertain, and uncertainty keeps you engaged. You keep giving chances, you keep explaining, you keep trying to fix the energy. You keep hoping the next interaction will be different. This is how subtle hatred stays close enough to influence you, because it's not trying to win your love, it's trying to keep access to your mind. One of the biggest signs of strategic hatred is a pattern of clean hands. They do things that hurt you, but in a way that leaves them room to deny intent. They'll praise you in public, then dismiss you in private. They'll congratulate you, but with a sting inside the sentence. "Whoa, I didn't expect you to pull that off. You're lucky it worked out. Must be nice. Good for you," said with a tone that feels cold. They'll act supportive when people are watching, because image matters more than truth, and then they'll quietly undermine you when no one can hold them accountable. Subtle hatred often shows up as disguised criticism. It's not direct enough to call out easily, but it's sharp enough to make you question yourself. They'll frame it as advice. "I'm just telling you because I care." But the effect is always the same. You feel smaller after talking to them. They'll highlight your flaws under the mask of honesty, but they never highlight your growth with the same energy. They'll remember your mistakes like a historian and forget your wins like they never happened. That's not being real. That's being invested in your weakness. Another trait of strategic hatred is selective support. They may support you when you are struggling because it keeps you beneath them. But when you start rising, when you start improving, when you gain confidence, when you achieve something, their energy changes. Their face tightens, their tone shifts, they become quiet or sarcastic or suddenly busy. This is because true hatred is threatened by your growth. It doesn't just want you to fail, it wants you to stay in a position where you never outshine them, so it competes without admitting it's competing. Strategic hatred also uses social camouflage. They build a reputation of being nice, helpful, funny, or reasonable. So if you ever point out the harm, people doubt you. That's why they love subtlety. It gives them plausible deniability. They can always say, "You misunderstood? You're too sensitive? I was joking? I didn't mean it like that." Notice what that does. It doesn't address your experience. It makes your experience the problem. This keeps you silent, because you start thinking, "Maybe I'm overreacting." And that silence is exactly what strategic hatred wants. They may also use information as a weapon. They ask questions like a friend, but they store your answers like an enemy. They learn what hurts you, what scares you, what you're insecure about, what you want, what you're building, and later, they use it to puncture you at the perfect moment. It might be a joke at a gathering, a comment in front of someone you respect, a subtle hint that makes you look unstable, careless, or untrustworthy. The goal is not to joke, the goal is to wound, while pretending it was nothing. And here is the hard truth. Good-hearted people often miss this because they assume everyone has the same conscience. If you would never sabotage someone quietly, you don't imagine someone else would. If you would never smile while envying, you don't suspect it. So you keep offering closeness to someone who is using closeness as access. That's why strategic hatred is effective. It exploits your innocence, your empathy, and your desire to keep the peace. The way you recognize real hatred is not through one sentence, it's through patterns. Consistent undermining, consistent subtle disrespect, consistent coldness toward your progress, consistent denial when confronted, consistent ability to make you feel wrong for noticing what you feel. When the emotional aftertaste of being around them is tension, confusion, or self-doubt, that's data. Your nervous system often detects what your logic tries to excuse. And once you see that pattern clearly, the power shifts, because strategic hatred relies on one thing, you not naming it. Confusion is one of the most underestimated weapons in human relationships, because it doesn't look like an attack. It looks like mixed signals. It looks like miscommunication. It looks like, maybe I'm reading too much into it. And that is exactly why it works. When someone truly dislikes you and wants to weaken you without exposing themselves, they often don't start with obvious insults. They start with fog. Because a clear-minded person is hard to control, but a confused person becomes easy to steer. Confusion steals your stability. It interrupts your ability to trust what you see, what you hear, and what you feel. And the moment your inner certainty is disrupted, you begin to do something that drains you. You start searching for clarity from the same person who is creating the confusion. That is the trap. You start explaining yourself more, defending yourself more, chasing answers more, trying to fix the vibe, trying to make it make sense. And while you're doing that, they are watching you lose your center. One of the most common ways confusion is created is through inconsistent behavior. They treat you well one day, cold the next. They seem supportive in public, dismissive in private. They offer help, then delay it. They compliment you, then immediately add a cutting line. You did good. I didn't think you could. Nice outfit. You look different today. I'm proud of you, finally. These aren't accidents, these are emotional mixed signals. Mixed signals keep you mentally busy. Your mind keeps looping. What did they mean? Was that a joke? Did I do something wrong? Why did the energy change? And while your attention is trapped in analysis, your confidence is being drained. Another method is moving goalposts. They change the rules once you follow them. If you speak up, they say you're dramatic. If you stay quiet, they say you're distant. If you're confident, they say you're arrogant. If you're humble, they say you're weak. No matter what you do, it's framed as wrong. That's not normal conflict. That's psychological destabilization. The purpose isn't to solve a problem. The purpose is to make you feel like you can never get it right. Because a person who feels like they can never get it right becomes easier to control. They start adjusting themselves to avoid punishment. Then there's denial and rewriting reality. The classic, I never said that. That didn't happen. You're imagining things. You're too sensitive. You always twist my words. When someone repeatedly denies what you clearly experienced, it creates cognitive dissonance, a mental tension between your memory and their version of events. If you have empathy, you will try to resolve that tension by doubting yourself instead of accusing them. That's why this tactic works best on people who are kind, fair, and self-reflective. You start thinking, maybe I did misunderstand. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I'm the problem. And once your self-trust is weakened, you become more dependent on them for truth. Confusion can also be created through misdirection. They refuse to address the actual issue. You bring up a specific behavior, they shift to your tone. You mention a broken promise, they suddenly talk about something you did months ago. You ask for clarity, they accuse you of being controlling. The conversation becomes slippery, and you walk away feeling like nothing got resolved, but you feel guilty, tired, and emotionally messy. That is not a communication style, that is a control style. A healthy person moves toward clarity. A manipulative person moves toward fog. Another subtle technique is public-private split. They act warm when others are watching, then become cold when you're alone. This makes you second-guess yourself, because part of your brain says, but they were nice earlier. And you start minimizing what happens in private. It also isolates you, because if you tell others, people may not believe you. They seem so nice. I've never seen them like that. This is how confusion becomes isolation, and isolation is where control grows. Confusion also shows up as strategic silence. They don't respond, they delay replies, they disappear, they withhold information. And you start filling the gaps with anxiety. Your mind starts creating scenarios, and you become emotionally reactive, not because you're unstable, but because uncertainty triggers the nervous system. The brain treats uncertainty as danger, so it seeks closure. The person who wants to control you uses that biology. They let you sit in ambiguity until you chase, and the moment you chase, they feel powerful. The most important thing to understand is the purpose of confusion. It's not to misunderstand. It's to make you lose your footing. When you are confused, you become easier to bait, easier to provoke, easier to embarrass, easier to blame. You start over, explaining. You start performing for fairness. You start trying to prove your intentions. You start negotiating for basic respect. And that is the moment your energy becomes their fuel. The antidote to confusion is pattern recognition. You stop focusing on individual sentences, and you start focusing on repeated outcomes. After interacting with them, do you feel clear, respected, and stable, or do you feel foggy, guilty, and off balance? A healthy dynamic may involve disagreement, but it moves toward resolution. A toxic dynamic creates loops where you keep revisiting the same uncertainty. When confusion is consistent, it's no longer confusion, it's a strategy. Doubt is one of the most effective ways to weaken a person without ever touching them, because when you inject doubt into someone's mind, you don't have to control them directly. They start controlling themselves. They start second-guessing their instincts, questioning their memory, shrinking their standards, and censoring their voice. And that is exactly why the person who truly hates you often gives you doubt, not as one big attack, but as small, repeated drops of poison that feel almost harmless in the moment. Doubt works because self-trust is the core of psychological strength. When you trust yourself, you make clear decisions. You set boundaries. You speak with confidence. You recover from setbacks faster. You don't beg for approval. But when self-trust is damaged, everything becomes harder. You hesitate. You over-explain. You ask for permission. You tolerate disrespect longer than you should. You start hoping people will treat you well instead of expecting it. And that shift is exactly what a hateful person wants. They want you uncertain, because uncertain people are easier to influence. The most common way doubt is planted is through subtle invalidation. They don't say, "You're wrong," loudly. They say it quietly, repeatedly, and in a tone that makes you feel silly for even reacting. You're too sensitive. You always overthink. You take everything personally. It's not that deep. You're imagining things. These phrases are not innocent when they're repeated. Their purpose is to train you to distrust your emotional signals. If you're told enough times that your feelings are too much, you start turning them down. You start silencing your intuition. You start ignoring your own body's warning system. And once you ignore your own alarms, you become easier to hurt. Another way doubt is planted is by questioning your memory. "I never said that. That's not how it happened. You're remembering wrong. You always twist things." At first you push back because you know what you heard, but after repeated denial, your mind starts negotiating. You think, maybe I did misunderstand. Maybe I'm not recalling it accurately. Maybe I'm the one making problems. This is especially effective on people who are empathetic and self-aware because they are willing to consider their flaws. A manipulative or hateful person uses your fairness against you. They turn your self-reflection into self-attack. Then comes minimization of your strengths. A person who hates you doesn't want to simply disagree with you. They want to reduce you. So they treat your growth like it's nothing. You accomplish something and they say, "Anyone could do that." You improve and they say, "It's not a big deal." You look good and they say, "You're trying too hard." They don't celebrate your wins, they reframe them as luck, timing, or attention-seeking. This creates a painful internal pressure, where you feel like you have to prove yourself harder, or hide your success to avoid their energy. That is doubt. It makes you question whether you deserve to feel proud. They also plant doubt through comparison. They highlight someone else's strengths right in front of you, and make it sound casual. "She's so confident, I love that." "He's so smart, he always knows what to say." Other people don't struggle with this. Comparison is a psychological blade because it attacks identity. It whispers, "You are not enough." If you're not careful, you start competing for basic respect. You start performing to earn what should have been given freely. And the more you perform, the more they feel powerful, because now your worth is under negotiation. Another technique is framing your boundaries as a problem. When you finally say, "I don't like this," they respond as if your boundary is the real issue. "Why are you so difficult? You're controlling. You can't take a joke. You're creating drama." The goal is to make you feel guilty for having standards. And guilt is one of the fastest ways to make someone drop a boundary. If they can make you feel guilty for asking to be respected, you'll start accepting disrespect to avoid being seen as too much. That is doubt in your right to protect yourself. Doubt also grows through strategic labeling. They give you an identity that keeps you small. You're emotional. You're unstable. You're insecure. You're not built for this. When labels repeat, they can become internalized. You start asking, what if I really am this? You start acting like the label because the mind tries to stay consistent with what it believes about itself. This is why words matter. Repeated words become beliefs, and beliefs become behavior. The most painful part is that doubt changes your personality. It makes you quieter. It makes you cautious. It makes you apologetic. It makes you afraid to take up space. You stop speaking freely because you don't want to be misinterpreted. You stop sharing ideas because you don't want them dismissed. You stop trusting your gut because you've been taught it's unreliable. And over time, you become someone who needs reassurance for decisions you used to make with ease. The antidote to doubt is not arguing with the person who planted it. The antidote is rebuilding your self-trust through evidence. You start documenting patterns. You start paying attention to how you feel after interactions. You stop debating your reality with someone committed to denying it. You surround yourself with people who increase your clarity instead of decreasing it. And most importantly, you practice one powerful rule. If someone repeatedly makes you question your worth, your instincts, and your sanity, the problem is not your sensitivity. The problem is their intention. Confusion and doubt almost never destroy you in one dramatic moment. They don't arrive with a siren. They arrive like slow water dripping onto stone, quiet, repetitive, and constant. Until one day you look at yourself and realize you've been worn down without noticing when it started. This is why these tactics are so dangerous, because they don't feel like an obvious attack. They feel like misunderstanding, a rough day, a joke that landed wrong. Maybe they didn't mean it. And that's how the erosion begins. The mind keeps making excuses to avoid the painful truth that someone's consistent behavior is harming you. Erosion happens when your brain is forced to live in uncertainty for too long. One confusing comment might sting, but you recover. One unfair accusation might upset you, but you can rationalize it. The damage comes when the pattern repeats again and again, because the nervous system cannot relax inside inconsistency. When you don't know what version of someone you'll get, warm or cold, supportive or critical, respectful or dismissive, your body stays on alert, and a body on alert becomes tired, reactive, and emotionally thin. That's how confusion becomes exhaustion. You start scanning for danger in normal moments. You start reading tone like a detective. You start overthinking your words before you speak. You start rehearsing conversations in your head, not because you're dramatic, but because your mind is trying to predict what it can't trust. Doubt adds another layer. It doesn't just tire you out, it changes how you see yourself. When someone repeatedly questions your feelings, your memory, your intentions, you begin to hesitate before you even act. You start thinking, maybe I'm wrong, before you've even checked the facts. You start apologizing to keep peace, even when you didn't do anything. You start shrinking your personality to avoid conflict. And this is the invisible cost. You don't just lose energy, you lose pieces of your identity. You stop speaking freely because you don't want to be misinterpreted. You stop celebrating because you don't want your joy to be mocked. You stop asking for what you need because you don't want to be called too much. That's not growth. That's self-censorship, and it's one of the clearest signs of psychological erosion. Over time, you might notice yourself changing in subtle ways. You become hyper-aware of their mood. You become addicted to fixing the atmosphere. You become the one doing emotional labor, trying to keep things stable, trying to make them happy, trying to avoid triggering their criticism. You start living in response to them, not in alignment with yourself. And that's what erosion really is. It shifts your center of gravity away from your own values and into their approval system. You begin measuring yourself by how calm they are, how pleased they seem, how little conflict happens, and you mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of respect. Erosion also distorts your standards. At the start, you would never tolerate certain things: disrespectful jokes, silent treatment, public embarrassment, twisting your words, inconsistent effort. But after enough confusion and doubt, your standards quietly lower. You begin accepting crumbs as if they are meals. You begin calling bare minimum progress. You begin bargaining with yourself. At least they didn't yell. At least they apologized. At least they were nice today. And you don't realize the bar has dropped from love to relief. Relief becomes your new normal, not because your needs got smaller, but because your nervous system got tired. Another part of erosion is social isolation. Confusion makes it hard to explain what's happening, because it's not one big event, it's 1,000 small cuts. When you try to describe it, people say, maybe you're overthinking, or it doesn't sound that bad, and you start feeling embarrassed for even bringing it up. So you stop talking. You keep it inside. And once you keep it inside, the other person's narrative becomes louder in your head than your own. That's how doubt grows, in silence, in loneliness, in the absence of outside perspective. Erosion also messes with your ability to trust future relationships. When your reality has been repeatedly questioned, you stop trusting your instincts. When you've been punished for speaking up, you hesitate to communicate. When you've been trained to expect mixed signals, you interpret normal delays as rejection, normal differences as danger. The damage doesn't stay contained to one person, it leaks into your confidence, your social life, your ambition, your peace, because your mind begins operating from defense, not from freedom. The most painful part is that erosion often looks like being mature. You tell yourself you're being patient, understanding, forgiving, flexible. But patience without mutual respect becomes self-abandonment. Understanding without boundaries becomes permission. Forgiveness without change becomes a loop. Flexibility without dignity becomes silence. And that's why the turning point is not a dramatic breakup, it's an internal decision. I will not keep paying for clarity with my self-respect. I will not keep negotiating for basic decency. I will not keep explaining my humanity to someone committed to reducing it. Because the moment you stop participating in the fog, your mind begins to return to itself. Patterns reveal intentions, and that is one of the most life-saving psychological principles you will ever learn. Because people can fake words for a long time, they can fake smiles, they can fake apologies, they can fake, I care. But they cannot fake patterns without eventually exposing themselves. A single nice moment can be theater. A single compliment can be strategy. A single apology can be a pause button. But repeated behavior is truth. Repeated behavior is the real message. Repeated behavior is the identity behind the mask. This is why the fifth keynote matters so much. Boundaries starve hatred. Not arguments, not begging, not over-explaining, not trying to make them understand. Because a person who truly hates you is not confused. They are committed. They are committed to undermining you, draining you, and keeping you off balance. So the goal is not to win them over. The goal is to stop feeding what they feed on, your reactions, your access, your attention, your emotional labor. To understand how patterns reveal intention, you need to stop focusing on isolated moments and start tracking outcomes. Ask yourself a simple question after each interaction. Do I feel clearer or foggier, stronger or smaller, respected or dismissed, calmer or more anxious? If the outcome is consistently negative, that is not an accident. A healthy person can hurt you sometimes, but they repair. They become clearer when you ask for clarity. They become softer when you express pain. They adjust their behavior when they understand the impact. A hateful person does the opposite. They become slippery, defensive, mocking, or cold, because your request for respect threatens their control. One of the biggest traps good people fall into is treating patterns like puzzles. They think, if I say it the right way, they'll finally get it. But some people are not missing the message. They are resisting accountability. They know what they're doing. They know how it lands. They just don't want to change it. So every time you return with another explanation, another emotional speech, another chance, you teach them something. You teach them that you will tolerate the pattern. And tolerance is interpreted as permission. That is why boundaries are the only language patterns respect. A boundary is not an argument. A boundary is not a threat. A boundary is a decision with a consequence. It says, if this happens, I will do that. Not to punish, but to protect. Because protection is the purpose of boundaries, and protection is what hatred hates. Hatred wants access. Hatred wants proximity. Hatred wants a front row seat to your mind. Hatred wants to poke you and watch you react. Hatred wants to make you explain yourself until you're exhausted. Hatred wants to pull your attention away from your goals and toward their games. So when you set boundaries, you change the environment they rely on. You stop answering immediately. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending your character to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stop sharing sensitive information. You stop seeking closure from the person who enjoys open wounds. You stop attending conversations that turn into fog. And that is how boundaries starve hatred, because hatred is fueled by your emotional engagement. If you keep reacting, they keep feeding. If you keep arguing, they keep winning, even if you win the argument, because the real win for them was stealing your peace. There is a mindset shift here that changes everything. You stop asking, how do I make them treat me better? And you start asking, how do I treat myself better? Because when someone repeatedly disrespects you, the main problem is not their behavior. The main problem becomes your access policy. Who gets access to your time, your mind, your energy, your vulnerability, your achievements, your plans, your emotions? Access is a privilege. When you continue giving access to a consistent pattern of harm, you are training yourself to accept harm as normal. And boundaries are not just external, they are internal. Internal boundaries mean you stop negotiating with disrespect in your own mind. You stop romanticizing small kindness as proof they've changed. You stop letting guilt convince you to stay in environments that damage you. You stop calling endurance love. You stop calling suffering loyalty. You stop calling confusion chemistry. You stop calling disrespect humor. Those internal boundaries matter because hateful people often rely on your internal confusion to keep you connected. When you implement boundaries, expect pushback. That pushback is information. The moment you become firm, a healthy person may feel surprised, but they will adjust. A hateful person will escalate. They'll accuse you of being cold. They'll call you selfish. They'll say you've changed. They'll try to provoke you into explaining yourself again. Why? Because your boundary is threatening their access, and loss of access is what reveals intention. People who cared about you will respect your boundary. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries will resent it. This is why patterns reveal intentions is not just a quote, it's a compass. It keeps you from being hypnotized by apologies that don't become change. It keeps you from being pulled back by nostalgia when the reality is harm. It keeps you from giving your mind to someone who only wants to take. So the strongest thing you can do is simple. You watch the pattern, you name the pattern, and you change the access. Because when your boundaries become stronger, their hatred becomes weaker, not because they suddenly become kind, but because they no longer have the fuel they were living on.